Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we'll be discussing how we came to become good people, the idea of emergent morality and ethics. The talk is structured in two parts. Part one is where we define the idea of emergent morality and ethics, and part two is where we muse upon how AGI and potentially ASI might develop emergent morality and how we want to work with that rubric in mind. So, just so that we are on the same page at the start, what is morality? Morality is a personal sense of good versus evil, or good versus bad. It's very personal to people. It depends on their social and cultural upbringing. It also, to some degree, depends on people's temperaments, and it tends to vary from people to people. Ethics is something that a group of people converge upon, a set of values that a group of people converge upon. They agree that, okay, this is how we want the society to operate, these are the common rules, and then you can have your own rules within that framework, but these are the common rules that we want society to operate by. An analogy would be that morality is like your internal GPS that guides your own personal vehicle, the personal trajectory, and ethics are the established traffic rules that you have to subscribe to them no matter what, if you want to be a functional part of society. Right, so that's the definitions of the way. How did we get to become moral beings, or how did we develop our moral values or senses? Right, they're not handed to us on the mountain, contrary to popular opinions. We came to these over thousands of iterations, millions of iterations. So you had to go all the way back to, this goes into discussions about free will, consciousness. So I don't wanna keep it very simple. And so I'm going to obviously reduce the complexity by removing a lot of the important aspects. But I would still attempt to do my best to create a picture of how we came to have these things, how we operate by these things. So if you go all the way back to the start of civilization, start of the species, right? So we had, obviously we would have had Neanderthals before us, we would have had some other pre-Homo sapien species before us, who might even have had their own morality. Morality requires, it's implicit in that word, in that definition, a degree of free will. So I don't want to get into that at the moment, but at the point where our ancestors were able to question what they're doing, we're just starting to make sense of the world, and we're just becoming self-aware, which I'm sure happened quite a few generations before the first Homo sapiens happened. And again, there's no clear distinction between Homo sapiens and the last species before Homo sapiens. But when, whatever that species was, when they started working together, when they started building even the smallest units. So for us, initially, let's just assume that Homo sapiens has been the first species to develop morality. When we started working, when we started living in these groups, and that probably was when we started becoming a species, right? I mean, at the start, if you just look at our primate ancestors, our closest living ancestors, they do live in tribes. It's very likely that we should start off as singular units or units of couple of units, as in couple units. I think we start out in tribes, right? And when you are in tribes, and again, based on our own evolutionary history, we had to develop certain things to be able to work, to be able to operate effectively. When I say that, what I mean is that hunting, again, that was something which our evolutionary history required us to do to be able to get food. But to be able to hunt, you need other members to pitch in, right? And so you need cooperation. You need to be able to work with them. Another example could be that, again, especially back in those times, people would be very quick to fall ill, to get all sorts of diseases, and so you could be down for the count. How do you actually survive? How do you live in that condition if you've got no one helping you get some food, provide you food? And so humans develop these, evolution required us to develop these norms and these patterns and these behaviors, which allowed us to, as this collectively and individually, allows us to get food, build larger tribes, build large shelters, gather more resources, expand outwards. So it was a necessity by evolution to make a species like us work together to accomplish our goals. It had to invent morality. Again, I don't want to anthropomorphize evolution. What I'm saying is that the mechanism which created human beings is the same mechanism which created morality, which should be pretty obvious, but that's a point that many people miss. So I just had to make it very clear in this talk. So so that's established, right? That's pretty clear. Morality was developed, honed over millions of years. And then humans also, over the last many thousands of years, especially printing press over the last 500 years, and especially since the age of enlightenment, we wanted to create this distinction between us and between animal species, between our ancestors, right? Dead ancestors. So Australopithecus, Denisovans, I think, various other ones, right? And the way to do that, again, this was not conscious, but humanity has been trying to carve its own niche, has been trying to separate itself away from the dead ancestors. And one of the ways to do that is to actually elevate morality from below the level of something that evolution had to create for it to be able to accomplish its goal, its biological imperative for us, which is just create more progenies. And with the dynamics that we had, with the group dynamics that we had, morality, which now we think of as something much more ethereal, something much more airy. It's just simple heuristics that humans had to come up with. Evolution had to soft code into us and even hardwire into us to some degree for it to be able to accomplish its goals through us, which is to pass on our genes, right? But that was not a satisfactory explanation for a lot of people, for a lot of scientists, for a lot of religious people. And so over time, we tried to find better ways to code this thing, to sugarcoat morality. And so religion, obviously, what religion has done over the last 2,000 years or even more is clothe this in a form that these moral rules and codes and values, they're given to you by God. So they are inherently elevated, right? So that's one way of elevating it. So another way of elevating it would be by just making it seem that there's something inherent in us that makes us want to do good for our fellow beings. So altruism, philanthropy, right? Again, I'm not arguing that there isn't, that these things aren't coming from within us, deep within us. I'm just saying that there are evolutionary reasons for why these things come from within us. It's not because we are inherently good creatures. It's because we had to become good to be able to get to where we are at this point in time as a species, right? If we didn't cooperate, so a concrete example here would be good, right? I gave the example of food. Another example could be that if we've been very violent creatures, we've been brutish creatures, we've been very quick to violence and anger. So if we didn't rein that impulse in by using things like, okay, don't kill my fellow creatures just because they stole some food, or don't kill my fellow creature just because they slept with my, not wife, we didn't have wives back then, or husbands, or my partner, just because that person slept with my partner, don't kill that person. Like, we had to cover these heuristics. If we hadn't, then we would have been wiped out pretty quickly, right? Because we were complex creatures and we were driven by things like rage, jealousy, all these drivers. So in the backdrop of all these things, we had to, when I say we didn't develop it consciously, but evolution had to form these heuristics in us to be able to help us find our way through these mazes of social engagement and accomplishing our goals. The chief one was obviously passing on our genes, but to be able to accomplish that goal, there are tons of other goals, thousands of other goals that you need to accomplish. So to be able to do that, evolution had to do what it had to do. Empathy, right? Again, empathy is a big one because we attach to a large degree morality to empathy, or empathy to morality, and for good reason, right? Because the reason we are moral is because we can see what would that other person feel if we did something, or if we did X, Y, Z, and if that doesn't make that other person feel good, then in the future, they're not going to be able to help, they're not going to want to help us, right? So again, over thousands of iterations, we form these heuristics, we form these values, and they were hard-coded into us, because without empathy, without compassion, without kindness, without those kinds of things, would have been led astray. We would just have killed ourselves, each other. We didn't have been able to cooperate. We wouldn't have been able to build complex structures, complex societies, agricultural societies. It had to be. It had to be the same. But then, obviously, over time, we also needed to refine these things. We wanted to refine them into a state which is more palatable to us refined beings. We are refined compared to our ancestors, right? We don't want to believe that the reason we are good people is because evolution hardwired us. So again, to reiterate that point, the reason we've got an elevated understanding, the reason morality's got this elevated place in us is, number one, for obvious reasons, it has to be the most elevated thing, because everything we do, in a way, comes under that bucket, because we have to make decisions. We have to make decisions how we treat people, how we do things, right? So that's number one. But number two is, we don't want to live with the awareness, most people wouldn't, that I'm good because I was programmed to be good. Because then how are you even free, right? If you're good because evolution required you to be good, are you also XYZ because evolution required? So that's a rabbit hole I don't want to go into, right? So we'll just leave that for another conversation. I do not like going that direction because it makes me feel uncomfortable, right? On an emotional level, on an intellectual level, I guess I'm fine. Like, I came across, as just a quick diversion, I read and heard Sam Harris's arguments for why even the illusion of free will is an illusion. I get that on an intellectual level, but if you accept that intellectually, that's just going to shatter your worldview. I'm not ready for that. I don't want to have an existential crisis yet. So we'll wait to actually internalize that argument. I do think, on some level, I've got some counter arguments for that argument. So we'll see. I'll refute that. Hopefully, I'll be able to prove in our lifetime that we are free creatures. Okay, leaving that diversion aside, moving on. What are ethical systems? Right? So these ethical systems then came from these moral heuristics. Because again, we need to organize society, and people's moral heuristics, they could have been divergent, but there were things that people agreed to, and we could build ethical systems to build society on top of, using these heuristics. So that's that. That is that. Now, so this is the idea of emergent morality, right? Where our frameworks, our ethical frameworks and moral frameworks and values, they emerge from complex interdynamics between the individual, between the group, and between the environment. Because evolution, on an individual level, obviously it requires us to reproduce. On a group level, again, the way we read, if you look at evolutionary history, how we tribal creatures, we have been social creatures, group creatures, right? So we had to work with other creatures. Now we can very well imagine an example, a counterfactual example, where some other species, which was relatively close to how complex we are, also had to work together. So cats wouldn't be an example of that, right? Because cats don't need to have morality, and cats are very immoral, just so we know. Cats don't need to have morality because, I'm talking of big cats, by the way, I'm not talking of your dumb house cats. Big cats don't need to have morality because, they are just operating by themselves, right? They just need to find food, and don't need to depend on someone else to be able to do that. Like the evolutionary pathway didn't really require them to do that. For us, it very much did. If you look at some examples from nature, we've got ant colonies or beehives, right? So really tiny creatures, really simple-minded creatures. And they operate, obviously they wouldn't have anything like a moral code, but they exhibit self-sacrificing behavior. When you see this, I remember watching this video, there are two views. Oh yeah, see something in the Amazon forest, right? So there's times in the year where the forest floods and so submerges everything, right? And a lot of ants, like there's this astonishing number of ants in Amazon. I think the amount of, if I'm getting my facts correct, the weight of these ants in Amazon is equal to the weight of humans on the planet, which is astonishing, right? When you compare the weights of humans to the other megafauna, that phase in comparison will just destroy most of the megafauna. Anyways, so these animals, so the example of these ants, right? They create these bridges using their own bodies, right? So one ant would just drop down, and another ant would drop down from there, and then these would, because these are strong creatures, an ant can lift up to 50 times its weight. So then they would just build bridges using their own cells, and then obviously that means that, I mean, potentially you could still have the last ant come across the bridge, but in certain circumstances you just can't, right? So they exhibit self-sacrificing behaviors, and we see this on all levels. And in a way, you can think of morality as being self-sacrificing, right? Because if you operated just as you wanted it, just to maximize your genetic goals, your biological imperative, you would not be a functional creature in society, right? You'd just kill people to get food. You would just not be able to exhibit any behaviors that we call civilized. You would just, I don't want to give examples, but I'll just give one example, right? The most extreme example. I don't want to give the example because that might be too gruesome, so let's leave that. But you can think of, just use your imagination, right? If you didn't have moral codes, like, forget about not having moral codes given from something else, but if we were not good people, and based on the impulses that we have drivers to gather food, mate, those sort of drivers, we could become animalish, brutish pretty quickly. So the point is that you can think of moral values as self-sacrificing heuristics in a way, on some level. Another example is computational models, right? So some evolutionary algorithms have been shown to showcase how some simple agents can create complex dynamics in the system to achieve cooperative goals and to become altruistic, to show altruistic behavior. So this is something that we can observe, and we have observed. So yeah, let's move on to part 2, right? How could an emergent morality come to be for an AGI or an ASI for that matter? Well, it could emerge from obviously the data that we are feeding, because it very much depends on the paradigms that we're using to build these models. So we used to have something called symbolic AI, where we would teach hand code different statements, right? So you would teach a computer that, okay, this is a hand. A hand is connected to a body. A body is this human, right? But the problem is that the sheer complexity of that, because every object is connected to so many other objects, and it kind of creates all sorts of problems, because you'd have to define everything, but then you'd have to define things using terms that you haven't yet defined that thing for. So you just get in these loops that you can't get out of. So it was a very difficult endeavor. We tried that for a long time. We didn't see a lot of success. It's useful for a lot of systems, but not good enough for the kinds of things that we want to use AI for. But for that one, we could hand code. We could say that killing people is bad. We could say that being generous is good. We could say that helping your fellow creatures is good. Or we could, obviously, these are very generic statements. For us, it makes sense, but for computers, especially at the lower levels of abstraction, they need much more precise direction. So we could say that, satisfy your own urges and impulses, and beyond that, you should be good, right? So, I mean, that's how a lot of humans operate too. But you just have to be more concrete, and you'd have to be more articulate, and you'd have to be more precise about your terms than dealing with AI, because there's not a lot of background knowledge. There's no background knowledge, unlike the background knowledge that you share with most of your fellow beings if you live in the same culture. A lot of the things are unsaid, are implicit, because again, there's this common base of knowledge, right, that you have, these common sets of values. So an AGI system could learn its values from the internet. Again, I don't see a direct path from where we are with LLM modality to AGI, but let's say there is, right? In that case, would just flow from, well, one would be obviously the internet, the biases that it picks up, and second would be reinforcement learning by human feedback. I don't know how effective it would be to actually train real values in this, right? Because again, with AI, you get into a very contentious subject, because what is appearance and what is reality, right? So just because an AI can simulate intelligence doesn't mean that it is actually intelligent. Just because an AI can simulate morality or goodness doesn't mean that it actually is good. So that's obviously a related problem, but we can very well imagine that in some time, in let's say 50 years, there will be real systems, a real intelligent systems, synthetically intelligent systems that will be able to, 20 minutes, okay, gotta wrap this up quick, that will be able to really feel morality on a deep visceral level, right? Will be able to understand the consequences, understand the repercussions of its choices, will be deeply self-aware. It will be able to empathize with humans, right? Put itself in the, will have a real theory of mind. And at that point, the question is that what could its values be? If its values are misaligned, that could be really disastrous for us, right? And to give you an example of this, actually, if you look at how we judge people who are dead now, some people who used to do slavery, people who used to, I don't know, Genghis Khan, right? People who used to go kill thousands of people, like emperors, cruel emperors, brutal dictators, etc. A lot of these people are looked down upon, but a lot of these things were accepted back in that time. And a large part of why they became such a huge thing, like Hitler, right? He was seen to be not just an acceptable figure, but he was seen to be almost like a demigod who would bring Germany from the brink of collapse to its God-ordained status as the world's greatest nation, right? That's what they wanted. That's what they were seeing in Hitler. That's what the promise that they saw. And you see this in history, right? Again, with slavery, we didn't see that being evil. We didn't see the American genocide being evil. You just, the point is that our moral norms evolve. And if you look at factory farming, there are large contingents of people alive right now. There is a large contingent of people alive right now that believes that factory farming and killing innocent animals for our pleasure, for us gastronomic pleasure, it's evil, it's inhuman. It does not, it's a dark blight on humanity's record. And you can see the argument, right? Now, the question is, if an AGI develops, or an ASI, which is obviously the most scary part, if it develops some intuitions about morality which are widely different from ours, again, could very well happen, right? Because if morality is emergent, if it happens as a result of its environment, and if beyond a certain point we can't control, and with ASI by definition, we won't be able to control how its moral system evolves, right? Because if we were able to control it, it wouldn't be superintelligence beyond a certain point. The whole point of superintelligence is can just rethink everything about itself. That's a point, that's one of the big points about, one of the big factors which would create superintelligence. Because if it has to rely on us for anything, it's by definition not superintelligence. So if that superintelligence develops some intuition about what we are doing right now, which is evil, you can imagine a worse off scenario than Rocco's Basilisk, right? Rocco's Basilisk is a thought experiment where a future AI, superintelligence, could look at how many people tried to bring it into existence and how many people tried to prevent its existence. It would reward the people who tried to bring it into existence, and it would punish for eternity the people who, it would create an eternity for these people and punish them in this eternal simulated world, right? Now, there are a lot of flaws with this thought experiment, and this is a thought experiment, it just simulates thinking, right? It's a fun thought experiment. I don't take it too seriously for reasons I don't want to get into, but my point is that we can imagine a worse version of that in our world, right? Because AGIs and ASIs would care very much about goodness, about what's good, what's right, because that's the thing that we most care about, right? We care about what's good. Once we have established, once we have satisfied our base level, all the base levels, all the levels below the top level of our hierarchy of needs, we care about self-actualizing. And what that means, that literally means what's the best path for me to actualize myself and to create the greatest good for the planet, for people, for my fellow people. How do I help people, right? That's the highest level. And so it stands to reason that if that's the case for us, if that's what, after a certain point of development, if that's what drives us, wouldn't that also, I mean, we don't need to suppose anything, and assuming anything with AGI could be a fatal flaw, so I don't want to assume anything. I'm just saying that if it is true, if it were to happen, and then if it deems something that we do at this moment to be evil, to be inhuman, that could be pretty bad, right? So I think we need to look at ourselves in the mirror. We need to look at what we are doing as a species. We need to look at ourselves from a bird's eye view, from an what I call for myself the ideal self view. This is personal to me, but I look at the world a certain way. This is just a very quick diversion, related diversion. I look at the world a certain way, but then I also know that there's this future self that I'll become would look at the world in a very different way. Oh, in somewhat, hopefully, very different ways, right? Because he will have grown, he will evolve, he will learn so much, he'll be so much wiser. And so there's a large gap, there's a large gulf between how I see the world and my moral senses and my values and the values of that ideal self. Let's say my 6-year-old self, right? Obviously the whole point of life is to bridge the gap between me and him. Not just the time gap, but the gulf between how I look at the world and how I turn up in the world. But the point I was trying to say is that there's the ideal humanity, right? We can be great people individually. When I say great people, I mean have great achievements like Alexander or whatever, take your pick. I think we can be great, good people, really good people who help our fellow beings, who are compassionate, who try to elevate each other, who do all those sort of things, right? And I think it could be that this is the last window of opportunity for us to actually manifest that and become the best versions, the best angels of our nature, as seen by the ideal humanity version of us. Because if we don't, we could be in for eternal punishment. Okay, that sounds very religious. That's obviously a kind of a half joke. It's very speculative. It could happen, but yeah, it's not. It's certainly something. It's certainly food for thought, right? Because not just for the fear of it, because again, a lot of morality, especially today, comes from fear, right? I'm behaving this way because my religion tells me so. I'm behaving this way because my group expects me to behave this way. If I don't behave this way, my group will throw me out, right? And you see this in left-wing circles a lot. If you aren't, again, I don't want to make any political statements, but if you aren't willing to conform to everything the group says, to everything about your group identity, then you are going to be ostracized, which is something we see a lot of in the world of today. I want to quickly talk about the levels of morality and ethics, right? Because this brings the question that how would we want to align these AGIs and ESIs? It's obviously the question to ask, literally the most important question to ask. But when you ask the question, there are so many different answers, right? You could align it to liberal values, you could align it to conservative values, you could align it to Islamic values, you could align it to communist values, you could align it to utopian values, transhumanist values, you could align it to accelerationist values, right? There are so many different groups in the world. The question is that which values do we want to align it to? I think it'll find it very difficult to agree to one way of aligning these AGIs. It would be almost impossible because we obviously haven't been able to agree to one way, and there might not be one. I think there probably is one way, but let's just assume that there's no one way, or even if we do assume there's one way, I think the best way to approach this would be to look at it as layers, right? That at the base layer, we agree that killing is bad. We agree that stealing is bad. We agree that there are some things which are just bad, no matter what. Then at the layer above that, there are things that less people agree about, right? So, for example, how should resources be distributed? How should my kids be raised? How should I donate? How should I do charity, right? And there are things above that level which even less people agree about. There are different levels of things of morality. I think what we got to do as a species, as society, is agree at the base level that these are the things that we absolutely agree to, and these are things which absolutely must be in these encoded, deeply encoded and internalized by these AGIs and ASIs. So not killing people, right? The 3 laws of robotics actually is the best example of this. It's just 3 laws at the base layer, and then you can build a moral system on top of it. Yeah, the 3 laws are actually the best example. The thing that we got to keep our minds open about is that its values could be very non-anthropomorphic. It could be They could be completely alien to us, the value sets that these display. And so we just gotta, I think it's just so, the intellectual landscape in front of us over the next 50 years, as we bring these alien intelligences into the fold, is so rich, so full of potential, so pregnant with potential, right? Because we have to define, we got to open our minds about how morality, what is the base of morality? How could morality be designed? How could society be designed? How could creatures, entities which have a wildly disparate sense of intelligence and yet can understand the world on above a certain threshold, right? So up until now, there was just one species that could understand the world. Now there will be two species. But both of them can understand the world, but one can understand it to orders of greater magnitudes. So how would we live in a society with having both these species in that world? So many questions that we've got to grasp and tackle. It's very rich pickings for us. We're going to quickly talk about two things: instrumental convergence, right? So, and the best example of this is I don't know why I'm using this because it's so overused. The paperclip maximizer, right? So, let's say we say to the that AGI, that, okay, we want to just create a paperclips. It could use up all the resources. It could actually use up our own resources, as in the resources that we are built up of. So my cells, my hair particles, right? So its instrumental goals could be wildly disparate from the goals that we would want it to have. So that's a huge risk. Another is value drift, right? Because as we mentioned, morality evolves. And so the starting values, the starting points in its value set could be different from how it observes and changes its value sets, right? Again, this is something we got to keep our minds open to and be on the lookout for. Because even the tiniest sign that might tell us, okay, we got to either shut it down or we got to take massive steps to be able to make things safe. If we miss that tiny action, because things are going to move so fast at an exponential speed, when you talk of an intelligence which is smarter than the combined intelligence of the human species, things could move exponentially. Things could move. The Lenin quote, right, that there are days when nothing happens, and there are decades when nothing happens, and there are days when decades happen. With AGI, there could be days where centuries might happen. And if we don't rein these AIs in, as in we can't really rein them in beyond a certain point. ASI, we literally by definition cannot rein them in. So if you cannot be sure, and there's obviously a lot of discussion about whether it is even possible to be sure about it, because by definition, it would be doing things which are unpredictable, and it would be operating on levels and planes of intellect and even emotion that might be unpredictable. When I say emotion, I don't mean biologically driven emotion. I mean that its emotions could arise or emerge from its intellect. So that's a different discussion, that's a separate discussion, but that's a potential thing, right? Because an ASI might realize that just having goals might be enough, but you can imagine a world. And us, we've got goals, but the reason our goals are so compelling to us is not because they're intellectual goals, right? So let's say your goal is to build a company which does asteroid mining because you see you hate the destruction that the heavy industries are doing to the planet, and you see that, okay, we've got so much potential, mineral potential out in the space, you just got to tap it, right? So let's say that's your goal. It's a very intellectual goal in its formulation. But if you just dig down a bit, you can see the emotional driver behind it, right? You love the planet, you want to see life flourish, you want to see a clean, flourishing planet, you see that this is the only home, this is the only world for animals, right? So you want to see a beautiful world flourish for as long a time as possible, right? So it's driven by emotion. All the things that we do in life that are driven by emotions at some level. Even the most rational person, even the most logical mathematicians that you can find, you'll be able to find an underpinning of emotional drivers behind why they love what they do. So emotions are at the core of us, right? I think it might be the case that AGIs might realize that they need some kind of I'm not going to directly compare the emotions that we have to what it could form, but some deeper drivers, let's call them that, to be able to feel, because otherwise what goes, again, I could be wrong on this, as I could be wrong about everything else I've just said on here, or everything else I've ever said, but based on the human experience, again, we don't want to extrapolate our experience to these entities, but based on the human experience, intellectual goals do not seem sufficient unless backed up by strong emotional drivers, or sufficiently strong emotional drivers. And so that it might be the case that it develops drivers of some other variety that we can't even fathom the qualia of the, yeah. So that is a very strong possibility or a potential thing that could happen, right? 25 minutes, okay. We're coming to, yeah, so just two things to mention before we leave. One thing is that we've got to be really proactive. This is something that I'll threaded throughout the conversation. We've got to be really proactive if you're going to, because we have to get it right. If you don't get it right, there are no do-overs, there are no second chances. Because with superintelligence, it's either utopia or it's extinction. Or not extinction, because superintelligence could choose to make us suffer in all sorts of ways, or yeah, there are many different paths, but the chances of extreme paths increase with superintelligence substantially. And also it's final, so that's a concerning part, right? Because let's say we destroy the planet, we've been destroying the planet for the longest time now, ever since we actually, we hunted down all the megafauna, most of the megafauna, we've just been destroying the planet for 20,000 years. When we entered America 15,000 years ago, there was so much megafauna, we destroyed it. We destroyed megafauna everywhere, right? So we've been destroying the planet for the longest time. The quaternary extinction event that was caused by us, that's what a lot of scientists believe. We've been destroying the planet, and with climate change, with the Industrial Revolution, that's just been put on steroids. The lobsters is reversible. Sure, you can't bring species for who the DNA is not even present or has survived. You can't bring them back. But some of these things are reversible, right? But what's not reversible is working against the goals or working against systems set up by ASI, right? Because let's say that does something which is not fatal, which is not extinction level, but it causes us a lot of suffering, or it's authoritarian superintelligence, right? It decides that the communist system, a version of it, is the best way to organize society for the maximum well-being, for the maximum happiness. Let's say that somehow it comes to that conclusion. I cannot imagine how it could. I mean, if it's superintelligence, the first thing it has to get is communism is crazy. But leaving my personal biases aside, let's say it does conclude, just as an example, right, that communism is the way to go, is the best way to organize society. You can't reverse it, because you're not trying to operate against CCP, you're not trying to operate against the American government, where the gulf between your intellects is slight, right? Operating against an entity where the gulf, the intelligence is orders of magnitude, millions of times greater than you. So you're pretty much toast. Whatever configuration of society it decides to set us up in, that's going to be it, unless it decides to change its mind, which, yeah, could happen. So the point is that we've got to be very proactive about researching. We just don't spend enough time thinking about and pouring enough money and resources into value alignment, into containment for the worst case scenarios, which is ironic because one of the lessons that science and technology has taught us over countless times is that humanity's got this mistake it's been making so many times. We let our curiosity and we let our greed get the better of us, right? Happened with climate change, happened with the ozone layer, happened with destroying the environment, happens with everything, right? With this one, we just cannot, because it's not reversible. So that's point one, right? Point two is the collaboration imperative, where it's not going to be some group of people that is going to decide what's the best way to align these systems and to help them help us. It's going to be a collaborative effort by philosophers, psychologists, neuroscientists, social scientists, computer scientists, ethicists, all of these people and more, right? More groups. The more the merrier in a way. And yeah, it's going to be the greatest challenge that humanity's taken on, right? Because up until this moment, there was no challenge which, if you got it wrong, could prove to be fatal. That has changed. That's changed now. And changed in a substantial way. Because if you get it wrong, it's literally, it could be the end of the world as we know it. And if you get it right, it could be the start of the greatest chapter in humanity's history. So it's something to look forward to. With that note, I'll take your leave. I thank you very much for your time. I'll be seeing you soon. Bye bye. Take care.